Welcome to the Ralston College podcast. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Today I have the pleasure of sharing a lecture by Dr. Jason Pedicone, an inspiring philologist, that is, a lover of language, and the co-founder and president of the Paideia Institute. In today's lecture, Pedicone hypothesizes that there are historical, societal, and technological reasons why certain figures throughout history have chosen to pay close attention to language. He takes us through a grand historical arc from the invention of the first minuscule script, the forgery of the donation of Constantine, to the man responsible for turning Nietzsche from a philologist into a philosopher, and finally to what philology means in a world that thinks it is a post-truth world. It's a fascinating journey. After tracing this historic arc, Dr. Pedicone turns to the timely subject of AI, where he sees both very real challenges as well as opportunities, solutions, and ways forward. In particular, he recognizes that the study of the humanities has an essential and indelible role to play, and this, I believe, gives cause for hope. For it's only in hard-charging, deep-thinking humanistic inquiry that the answers to those questions can be found. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Thanks for listening.
No, it's really, it's great to be here among sort of close friends, and I'm just so inspired by Ralston. I just think it's an amazing institution, and I love interacting with students and hearing your stories and, about what inspires you to spend your time and energy and attention working on things like ancient Greek or the classical humanities. I think it's really important. And in fact, but I think part of the reason why this talk is eccentric, as Stephen put it politely, was because I was originally invited down to talk about the company that I co-founded, which is the Paideia Institute, and sort of talk about entrepreneurship and the humanities, social entrepreneurship, which I'm going to do on Friday. So if you want to come and hear that story, I'll tell you the whole story. But I asked if I could give a talk on the history of philology, because I'm really interested in it, and I'm thinking about it and trying to figure out what the hell is going to happen to the study of the humanities in like the 21st century with the advent of AI and all these massive changes in the world. So this is a sort of selfish attempt to try to like create a laboratory to think about this question, and I hope we can have a conversation, and I hope I can get some feedback from you guys in this room, because I don't feel like I have it figured out. I don't think anyone really does, but I feel like it's super important, and I think about it all the time. So the title of my talk, Society, Technology, and Philology, Thoughts on the Study of the Classical Humanities at the Dawn of the Digital Revolution. And does anyone know what philology is? Have you heard that word before? It's about close attention to language, right? But it's a word that's also changed meaning over time. And so referring to yourself as a philologist has meant different things at different times, which we're going to look at. When I did my PhD, I was in the literature and philology track in PhD. So it's like, okay, it must be something different than literature. Otherwise, they just would have called it literature. This is a question I don't think anybody really has a good answer, because it's changed. It sort of means different things at different times. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. I'm a classicist, and you guys know Greek, so we always get to start at the beginning. The first occurrence of the word philologos in Greek literature occurs in Plato, which is nice and neat. Well, it's nicer when it occurs in Homer, but Plato's okay. So this is a section of the Republic where they're talking about how to know like what's important for the study of like who speaks most truly about justice, right? And he says, how can we determine who speaks most truly? And he said, if we're talking about honor, we'd ask the person who loves honor. And if we're talking about money, we'd ask the person who loves money. But we're talking about justice, and so therefore, it needs to be judged by what does he say? Experience, intelligence, and discussion, right? So then we have to ask the philosopher, right? But he doesn't just say, let's just ask the philosopher. He says, the philosophos te kai ho philologos. And it's like, okay, well, thanks, Plato. Why make the distinction? They must be different somehow, right? And so if you look through classical Greek literature, which is when this word starts popping up, it basically comes to mean a lover of discussion, right? And is sort of separated from philosophy as a separate act, which is like related to philosophy, clearly, te kai, right? But different somehow, right? So that's where the word sort of comes to life. Later on, once we get into the Hellenistic period, the word starts to take on like a more specific meaning. And we have this quote from Suetonius, where he has this interesting treatise on grammarians. And he tells us that this guy, Aristophanes, who was an Alexandrian scholar, he took it on, ho Philologos. He actually sort of named himself ho Philologos because of his vast learning. And so it transitions over time, in the beginning from sort of just like a love of conversation into a much more sort of like designation of specialized learning, okay? And that's really the meaning that it carries forward into the history of classical scholarship. So when people start to talk about philology, it's not just that like you love a great chat. It's more this like technical expertise, right? So that's my intro to the word. Now I'd like to take a little historical tour of philological interventions, right? So let's just like walk through the history of Western civilization and think about some times when people have decided to pay really close attention to language. And my thesis is that like this happens for a reason, right? There's usually historical or societal or technological reasons why people are suddenly being like, wait, let's take a closer look at this, right? And like, what does this word actually really mean, okay? So I want to start with what I would propose, if it actually happened, and this is debated, would qualify as like the first major philological intervention in Greek literature. Do you guys know about Pisistratus? Have you ever heard of Pisistratus, the tyrant of Athens? This is a sort of politician holding court at Athens in the 6th century BC. He's one of the main sort of people who set up Athens as an important city in Greece, right? Now, there's this theory, and it's a theory because the ancients tell us, so I have Cicero on here, that Pisistratus arranged Homer. He was one of the first person who said, okay, there's all these bards, singing the Iliad and the Odyssey, but we need to like make an official version, right? And why do we think that he did this? Well, in Homer, there are these funny passages in which Athens is talked about in a way that makes it seem way cooler than it actually was in the time of Homer. Athens was kind of a backwater at that time. It didn't really blow up until the 6th century with Pisistratus, right? So then why in the catalog of ships, for instance, do we get this passage talking about what an amazing city Athens was and how the king of Athens, right? What does he say? Like unto him was no other man upon the face of the earth for marshaling of chariots and of warriors that bear that shield, So it would be like, if you were talking about American cities and there was a catalog of American cities and it was like New York, Chicago, LA, Mobile, Alabama, why is Athens? So this makes people think, maybe Pisistratus, was like, hey, we're going to do this. Like, let's just, insert a little bit about Athens to, put us on the map. Okay. So if that did happen, that would have been an early philological intervention. But there's all sorts of questions about like, did this even happen? Is it possible? What was the status of writing at this time? Because we're still pretty early on, and writing is not very diffuse in Greece. So it's not totally clear that he would have like made a manuscript necessarily. And so then if you're not making a manuscript, how do you control the version? So it's an interesting sort of uncertain question. But as you can see, political and potentially technological issues sort of governing whether philology happens and why, okay? Fast forward 300 years and we're in the Hellenistic period. Why is it called the Hellenistic period? What's the verb? Hellenizdo means to Greekify. It was when the world got Greekified, right? Because Alexander the Great had had his conquests, and his generals sort of became the rulers of different parts of the Greek world, and Greek culture spread out, right? This is the period when koine is established as a new form of Greek. The reason it's called koine is because it's koinos, or kinos, as you guys say. Because lots of different people all over the world are speaking this language, which as a result is going to have a sort of simplifying effect, right? So what's going on philologically in this period? Well, lots of interesting stuff. You guys will be grateful to Aristophanes of Byzantium, the inventor of the circumflex. This is the time when all the Greek accents were invented. And the reason for that was that the people in Palestine who were speaking Greek didn't speak Greek like they did in 5th century Athens, where theoretically they had this perfect fifth that they were, you know about this theory? That it was like so they had to write it down, the traditional accent of speaking Greek, because it didn't carry geographically, and that's where the accents come from. He also invented the period, but not the question mark, or possibly, but not in Latin. We're going to get to that. You also have Aristarchus. Aristarchus is the guy who made the first real sort of established edition of Homer. And you have Callimachus of Cyrene. Callimachus was more of a poet, but is the main figure responsible for what I would call Alexandrian poetics, and sort of bringing a philological approach to literature to the world, right? So from the time of Callimachus, and his main thing was like, I'm not going to write big epics like Homer, right? I'm going to be really focused. And I'm going to keep my muse slender, is how he used to put it, right? And that then infects not just Greek literature going forward, but also the literature of the most important Greek Hellenistic kingdom, which was Rome. A really great way to understand Roman history is to understand that it was just another Hellenistic kingdom. And that all those politicians, Julius Caesar and Pompey, they're all just Hellenistic kings fighting, just like has been going on for 100 years. Nothing new, right? So there's all sorts of wonderful instances of this in Roman literature. You guys are more Hellenists, so I'm not going to go crazy with Latin. But it's worth noting, for instance, Ennius, one of the first Roman poets. We only have him in fragments, but when he talks about himself, this is the first person to write hexameters, dactylic hexameters in Latin, and he talks about himself as a poet and why he's great. And he says, nec dicti studiosus quisquam erat ante hunc. Nobody was dicti studiosus, zealous about language. What was he doing? Dicti studiosus. Well, some people think he's translating the word philologos, okay? A lover of language, right? So he's like, my whole poetic program is philology, right? And this is why you get other crazy stuff like, okay, the actual first poem in Latin is by this relatively unheard of slave named Livius Andronicus, and he translates the Odyssey, right? And the first line of the Odyssey in Latin is, sing to me, he says Camena, which is like a native Italic deity, the man of many turns. And in Latin, he translates it as versutum, or versum in classical Latin, having been turned. What's another meaning of that word? To translate. Aversion, right? So he's like, sing to me, in his translation into Latin, he's like, sing to me of the translated man. Right? It's like totally meta, you see? And this is philology. This is the Alexandrian philological approach to poetry. Okay, let's keep moving. We're going to fast forward another 600 years, real quick. Late Antiquity. Jerome, ever heard of him? Yes. What did Jerome do? He translates the Bible, and he does arguably what some people would say is the first proper philological translation of the Bible, which is to say this guy knows Latin really well, Greek really well, and Hebrew, sort of, he was learning. And so he actually makes like a proper translation. You guys just read John, yes? Remember this? En arche ein hologos. Yes. Kai hologos ein pros ton theon, kai theos ein hologos. And you know this in English, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, etc. So Jerome translates it this way into Latin. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. Why? Why did he choose verbum for logos? Is that the word you guys would have chosen? No. Well, he thought about it. And if you pay attention a little bit to what was going on at the period, historically and also technologically, you can get some interesting insights. Okay, so we're at the end of the 4th century. Christianity is brand new. There are lots of heresies floating around. What are heresies? They're choosings, haireo, right? It's like where you pick and choose your theology instead of following the standard plan. So that they needed an official version of the Bible, because the Bible was different in all different places. There are all these different versions of what are known as the Vetus Latina, and it says this in one manuscript and that in another manuscript. So Jerome was asked actually by Pope Damasus to write this translation. And so he did. He was living in a monastery in Bethlehem. He was in Israel when he did this translation, which I didn't know before I wrote this talk. And he was hanging out with rabbis learning Hebrew. Right? So that's how he was able to, do the Old Testament directly from the Hebrew, the New Testament from the Greek into Latin. Here's what's cool. In a letter to Paulinus of Nola, his buddy down near Naples, he writes, "Logos enim Graecae multa significat." For logos in Greek has many meanings. It means word, but also reason and reckoning and the cause of each thing, through which all things that exist subsist. And you can see him listing the Latin options. Ratio, reason. Supputatio, could you imagine? In principio erat supputatio. Et causa unius cuique rei. So he's got these options in his head. It's not like he just, and it's interesting because if you look at the Vetus Latina, it actually says in principio erat verbum. So the tradition already had it, but he thought about it and he was like, yeah, let's stay with this, right? So why? The letter's interesting. He said, this letter, if you read it, it's a fascinating letter. It's all about Jerome's attitude towards scripture. And he's like, basically, the ancient philosophers do not get the Christian God, okay? This is not a rational thing. This is divine revelation, and it's super rational. So that's why the very next thing he said is, all these things we rightly understand in Christ, this the learned Plato did not know, okay? So there was a tradition in Neoplatonism and in Stoicism to see the universe organized by a rational principle, logos, right? And so Jerome is intentionally not going with that. Instead, he's choosing verbum, word, and this is super interesting. I think he did it possibly because he was in Jerusalem hanging out with rabbis where, God said, let there be light. The word of God is this creative force. In Hebrew, apparently, which I don't know, speech and creation are linguistically linked, right? So this was an intentional choice, right, to set the history of Western Christianity on a revelation-oriented theology. Fascinating, no? And it's all done via philology. All right, next example, 9th century. This is amazing. So by the 9th century, what's going on in Europe? Things are falling apart even worse. I mean, we're sort of just coming out of the Dark Ages. Ever heard of Charlemagne? Carolus Magnus, what did he do? Well, yeah, he sort of unified Europe under the Frankish kingdom and created the Holy Roman Empire. He was blessed by the Pope as Holy Roman Emperor, and he sort of brought a new level of order to European society. And one of the ways he did this, and in fact, one of the ways he needed to do this was via philology, okay? So Charlemagne had a problem. People didn't know Latin well, the priests didn't know Latin well, okay? And so there were priests, this is an example which I find really funny, of a priest in Bavaria, one of his, this is a little before Charlemagne, but it shows what was going on. There was a priest in Bavaria baptizing people in the name of the Fatherland and the Daughter and the Holy Spirit. And this Saint Boniface writing to the Pope being like, do all these people need to be rebaptized because you got the Latin wrong, And the Pope was like, nah, it's fine, just leave it. Really, his response is like, non debes rebaptizare. It's amazing. But what's also interesting is that you see technological and philological attempts to solve this problem. This is an edict that a guy named Alcuin of York sent out in the 9th century. De Literis Colendis, which is like basically like, guys, learn your Latin. This is pathetic, right? This goes out to the empire. Everybody has to study Latin because he says, we're seeing the neglect of the study of language and the impacts that it's having. Keep this in mind as you think about what's going on now. I think it's relevant. And so there's this like empire-wide attempt to get language going again. And simultaneously, there's these fascinating technological innovations. So they invent the first minuscule. So this is another thing I learned while preparing this talk. Prior to the Carolingian Renaissance, as it's called, most scripts were majuscule, which means, like, look at this 8th century Iris manuscript on the left. All the letters are more or less the same size, and there's no spaces, right? So you just get like this one continuous line of text, and the letters are all basically squares with lines in them, more or less. And it's like really hard to make out. And so Alcuin and the scholars in Aachen, where Charlemagne was set up, create a minuscule which has lowercase letters and spaces. Now, why is that important? Think about this. This is kind of fascinating. It's occurred to me. Why are lowercase letters better for recognizing and reading words than all uppercase? Because they have what are called ascenders and descenders, which are these little lines, like the D goes up and the G goes down below. And what that means is that the shape of the word, the sort of pictogram that the word makes, they look more different, right? There's like more variety of shapes, and so the human brain can more easily pick out, whatever, frater from aurum or whatever. And that's a technological innovation, right? They're like, oh, if we stick lines out of this stuff, they'll be easier to pick up off the page. They also invented the question mark. So this is the first question mark in the West. There might have been question marks in Greece, which it didn't count as the West at this time. But this thing right here, this is the Goldescalt Evangelistary. It was a sort of a prayer book made during the Carolingian Renaissance. And that little thing right there is a question mark. So when you look at a question, what a question mark is a dot and then kind of like a circumflex thing, which eventually the circumflex moved over and got joined, right? So they introduced spacing, punctuation, and these like changes. And so these are technological. This was technology at the time. Language is a technology. All right, we're almost done. We're getting there. Let's jump forward to the Renaissance. There's some fun stuff happening here. All right, anybody know about the donation of Constantine? This is Constantine writing a document in which he leaves control and authority of the Roman Empire to the Pope, right? So by the Renaissance, the Pope was using this document to justify all sorts of appetitive territorial actions in Latium and Naples and all over Italy, right? And this was irritating the politics of the time. And everybody knew, or not everybody, but this thing was obviously a fake, right? And so what's interesting about the Renaissance, and what I sort of gleaned from writing this talk, which I hadn't gotten before, is a lot of the reform stuff that led to the Reformation actually came from inside the church. These great Catholics who remained Catholics and remained with the Pope during the Reformation, nevertheless, gave a lot of ammo to Martin Luther, okay? And this is one of them, because this is amazing. So you have to read the text of the donation where he says, so this is Constantine writing. He says, we together with all our satraps and the whole Senate, you're all laughing, so you're all, and all the nobles, we just, paraphrasing, we decided to give, all of this to the Pope. look at Valla. This is Lorenzo Valla. What? How do you want to have satraps come in here? This is written in Latin. He published this against the Pope. Numbskull, blockhead. Do the Caesars speak like this? Are Roman decrees usually drafted thus? Whoever heard of satraps being mentioned in the councils of the Romans? So he calls him out based on the use of this vocabulary word, right? And says this is nonsense. And it's an amazing 30-page document in Latin where he totally demolishes this document as a medieval forgery and then totally undercuts the Pope's claim to, terrestrial dominance over these political areas. It didn't look so good for the papal religion, right? Here's another great example, which you guys will get. I absolutely love this one. Erasmus, Desiderius, yeah, you're nodding. He's the man. Desiderius Erasmus. Okay, So perhaps inspired by Valla, Erasmus decides he's going to redo Jerome. Okay, he's gonna redo the whole New Testament. He publishes this work called Novum Instrumentum Omne, which is a hell of a name for a translation of the Bible. You can almost hear the scientific revolution, the gears turning in those words, no? And so he goes at it, he translates the entire thing. He's looking at the Hebrew, he's looking at the Greek, and he's producing a new Latin translation, okay? I'm gonna zero in on this one particular piece of Luke. You ever heard of Hail Mary, full of grace? Okay, so that's not really what it says in the Greek. In the Greek, it says Kyrie. Can you guys read that? Kekeritomeni. What does that mean?
Having been graced.
Graced, yeah, having been graced. Yeah, exactly. So this is where it gets interesting. What does that mean exactly, right? Because in Catholicism, there's Marian doctrine, right, of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which basically states that Mary occupies a special position vis-a-vis other humans. She was conceived without original sin, which allows her to occupy a sort of special conduit to God that other people sort of don't inhabit, right? So she has special kind of ontological status in the Catholic faith. Now, this is what I love. That is rejected, of course. The church does not adopt, even though Erasmus was Catholic, they do not adopt Erasmus's translation. And instead, the Vulgate is redone a little bit later. And so there's what's called the Clementine Vulgate. And if you look at the Clementine Vulgate, Ave Gratia Plena stays the same, right? Hail Mary, full of grace. And if the Douay Rheims Bible from the 17th century, which was sort of like the standard English translation, has full of grace. But the King James, which is a Protestant Bible, what do they take? Because what do the Protestants do? They're like, this whole thing about Mary, the Immaculate Conception, and all this special stuff, no, that's like a way for us to not participate in the papacy, right? And so he gives fuel to the Protestants, perhaps unintentionally, but here's what's amazing. In the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, the Bible is reviewed again, the Catholic Bible, and they do a new Vulgate translation in Latin, and also an English translation. The Latin keeps Gratia Plena, but the English goes to preferred. So they follow highly favored or favored one, which I just think is amazing, right? And the reason for that is that the New American Bible, which is the standard Catholic Bible, goes directly from the Greek and Hebrew. It doesn't translate from the Latin. So the church must have decided to, for sort of traditional reasons, just leave Jerome's Gratia Plena in the Latin, but I don't know what they were thinking. They just sort of caved in the English. And so Erasmus is vindicated. He's probably loving this in his grave. Okay, let's move on. I think the most interesting tidbit of the entire thing is that there's this discrepancy between the Latin, the Nova Vulgata, which is the official Bible, Latin Bible of the Vatican, and the official English Bible of the Vatican, pulling from two different manuscripts. Philology, it's amazing, right? Okay, let's keep going. Anybody ever read any Nietzsche? Yeah, okay. So what's going on in the Enlightenment, historically, culturally, technologically? The scientific revolution, right? It's like it's the age of reason, the age of science. The Germans actually invented a new word for Wissenschaft. You know this word? Yeah. I once gave a talk called The Enlightenment When Wissen Gets the Shaft. It was about German scholarship in the 18th and 19th century. So Nietzsche publishes The Birth of Tragedy, which if you've never looked at it, I highly recommend checking it out. It's a sort of work of sort of mad, staggering genius, where he tries to sort of read all of Greek culture as this fight between Apollonian and Dionysian elements in human nature. Anyway, this other guy on the right, Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Moellendorff, who looks like a barrel of laughs, doesn't he? he writes a review of The Birth of Tragedy that ends Nietzsche's career as a classical philologist, okay? It's called Zukunftsphilologie, Philology of the Future. And he basically just trashes the entire thing and says, this is unprofessional, unscientific nonsense, and Nietzsche should be run out of the chair of classical philology in Basel, where he's teaching. And in fact, he leaves. And the word here that's important is science, right? Because Wilamowitz, who goes on to be sort of the father of, the grandfather maybe of modern classical studies as it's classical philology, is obsessed with meticulous, focused, word-oriented language research. He does not have time or interest in these rollicking philosophical readings of the ancient world. And this is really the guy, Wilamowitz is really the guy responsible for making Nietzsche a philosopher, as opposed to a philologist. And Nietzsche actually never published it. He has this amazing treatise called We Philologists, Wir Philologen, in which he just rants about the state of philology in 18th and 19th century Germany, where he's just like, these people are all pedants and they're like working on these like hyper specialized things and none of them have any soul and they don't understand the real spirit of antiquity. And he rants in sort of aphoristic fragments, but it's fascinating. He's like, they don't even like Wagner, It's like, obviously they're immature souls if they can't appreciate Wagner. But the main philological intervention of this period, I would argue, is the Prolegomena ad Homerem by this guy, Friedrich August Wolff, who's another sort of foundational figure in early classical scholarship. So what does he do? In a nutshell, this is the guy who kills Homer, okay? And I say, by saying that, I mean he kills the idea that there was a Homer. This is the first work of classical scholarship that really scientifically and systematically proves that Homer couldn't have been one person, right? And he does this through all sorts of interesting, examinations of language and the structure of things. And this eventually culminates in Milman Perry and really interesting studies of Homeric formulae. But what a philological act of the age of science, right? Like, this guy dissects Homer almost, as it were, on a gurney, right? And points to all the different poorly fitting parts of Homer and explodes this myth of this, this classical figure who's foundational, to the sort of old way of doing things. This is the new scientific scholarship. And we're still living with the after effects of this stuff in universities today, I would argue. All right, we're nearly there. One more. Derrida, heard of him? Ever tried to read him? Yeah? Did you succeed? Yeah. So my sort of last place I want to stop is 20th century philology. Like, what is the kind of philology that's going on after the fall of communism, World War II, the Holocaust, times in which sort of meaning and even like sort of belief in truth at all has been, belief in God, belief in truth has been like utterly shaken. What we find, I would argue, are philological, also the age of mass media, right? Where more and more people are getting their information not from written books, but from people talking at them on screens. We find what I would argue is a philology that, rather than attempting to drill down and establish the authoritative, true version of a thing, begins to make the case that there is no meaning, there is no truth, and focuses on language in an attempt to do that. And this is Derrida's famous essay. I chose it partially because it's Greek, so you guys can, can sort of connect to it. But it's also just an amazing example of this. So Derrida comes up with this idea of deconstruction. And his idea is basically that language never means what you want it to mean. Any attempt to say anything in language is always an approximation. And that failure of language, ultimately, if you read it right, can contradict itself. And so you can sort of look at these antitheses inside language to do these kind of devastating readings or pull out interesting observations. So this is a passage from the Phaedrus. And have you guys read the Phaedrus? Yeah, you remember the what's his name? Thoth. So Thoth invents writing, and he comes to this king in Egypt, and he says, "I have discovered a remedy for both memory and wisdom." Right? And the Greek is "Nemes te kai sophias pharmakon helrethe," a pharmakon, a drug, a remedy, a cure, right? And the king responds and says, "No, I mean this pharmakon is going to ruin people's memories because they're going to depend on writing to remember stuff instead of keeping it in their heads." Right? So what Derrida notices, and he argues, when it comes to the critical theorists, you can sort of, debatable whether they're sort of onto something or just totally crazy. The death of the author, by the way, happens around this time too. Roland Barthes, you ever heard that? Like, the intention of the author is not the primary determinant of the meaning of a text. It's like sort of made by the reader and the text at the same time. It's a little woo-woo, all this stuff, but pharmakon in Greek means both healing remedy and poison, right? And so Derrida's idea is that Plato didn't think of this, that actually his attempt to argue for the primacy of spoken word over the written word, which is like the argument that's being made in that little part of the Phaedo, is ultimately undermined by this double meaning in the word, by the inability of language to sort of fully express what the user wants to express. So this is philology trying to sort of undermine the very idea of meaning in the 20th century. Okay, so now I have a video to show you. Have you guys seen this one yet? You know what that is? Optimus. Optime. Yes. That is a Tesla bot. Okay? That's a humanoid robot catching a tennis ball. That's not a human being inside a suit. That is AI manipulating the physical world around it with scary subtlety and precision, right? When I watch that video, I think to myself, that thing is going to be doing a lot of stuff in the next 10 years. You guys have already probably started experimenting with large language models. I would argue that AI, the advent of AI, is comparable to the invention of the alphabet, or maybe vowels. The Greeks invented vowels in terms of the impact that it's going to have on human society. Perhaps not because it's as innovative, but because of the time frame in which it's going to land, right? So what is happening now is technologies are coming online, and I showed this, and not like, I didn't like bring up ChatGPT and be like, hey, outline Derrida's Plato's Pharmacy for me, which I could have also done to show how you can use large language models to like access knowledge and literature at a speed and scale that was unimaginable just like 5 years ago. This is even scarier because it's not just coming for the white collar workers. These things are going to be picking strawberries and folding clothes and building houses and who knows what else, right? Soon. And I think it behooves anybody who's thinking right now to think really hard about what this means for humanity in general, which obviously everybody is, but also what it means for the humanities. And the reason I want to bring that up is because every time I talk to a humanist about AI, they say, oh yeah, it's kind of like, students are going to cheat on their essays. That is not like the most interesting problem that is like presented by this technology. It's like, yes, people can plagiarize their essays, but I think it has much more profound and interesting implications for the study of the humanities. And that's what I would like to talk to you guys about, or talk about right now, to the extent that we have time for conversation and questions. I've come up with some thoughts, which I can present to you, but I'd also like to hear what you guys think. So with that, telos, and maybe we can transition to some Q&A.
Let's do it. Thank you. You've been listening to the Ralston College podcast. Today's episode featured a lecture by Dr. Jason Pedicone, which took us on a sweeping historic journey through time and place to look at several moments when historic figures paid particularly close attention to language. By exploring the various historical, societal, and technological reasons for this linguistic focus, Dr. Pedicone clearly showed the power of philology to interpret both texts and history. What's more, he revealed the power of language to exert a major influence on society, often in tandem with major technological advances. As we enter an increasingly digital age, we can glimpse the profound effects that artificial intelligence will have on the development of language, the way we communicate, and in the way we live. As its influence increases and its use and abuse becomes more ubiquitous, it's vital that we hold fast to what it is that makes us human. If you enjoyed this lecture, you might want to take a look at our Symposium on Renewal and Renaissance, an event which took place in February of this year and gathered an array of leading thinkers, artists, educators, and students to discuss how we might rebuild our shared culture. You can find that on our website or on Ralston College's YouTube channel. Ralston relies entirely on the generous support of donors who believe in our mission to share humanity's rich intellectual and artistic heritage with seekers of truth and beauty from across the world. If you found this lecture meaningful and would like to see more talks and discussions of this kind, then please consider making a gift to support our work via our website at www.ralston.ac. And deepest thanks to all of you who already support our work. We are enormously grateful. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Till next time.